So I know I made this video like 3 months ago, but the editing was cheeks, and there's a whole new game mode that's been added to Overwatch, and a new hero, and some of my old opinions have changed. But regardless, let's get into it. D.Va. Her best map is still Dorado in my opinion. D.Va is still as flexible as ever, and she's honestly good on most maps, or when there's tons of angles and high ground, giving her boosters and defense matrix more value. Gibraltar and Numbani are also good shouts. Her worst map is still, without a question, Lijiang Control Center, and probably Lijiang as a whole. Unless the enemy team are running ranged heroes like Pharmacy, Ashe on that map, you're basically trolling when you pick D.Va. It's way too enclosed and short sightline for her, hence she gets rolled over by heroes like Ryan, Zarya, and more commonly, Orisa on that map. Doomfist. His best map I think is Nepal Sanctum or Nepal Shrine. I also think Suravasa is a pretty good shout here too. My reasoning is that they're relatively short sightlines, and their maps have decent amounts of cover, allowing him to get slam value while also having flanks for Doomfist to approach from and utilize. The maps aren't too linear, but they're also not too wide and barren either. His worst map has to be Havana. I genuinely don't know what you do on Havana 3rd, because that point has barely any flanks and their sightlines are super long and open. At least on Junkertown and Circuit Royale 3rd points, he's pretty solid, same with Junkertown 2nd too. Junkerqueen. She's less broken from when I released that original video, thank gods, but I still think Queen's best map is Colosseo. Very linear, which is good for a rampage, plenty of cover, which is good for brawling, and good sightlines too. Her worst map is likely Dorado. I don't think I've ever seen Junkerqueen on that map, and for good reason. Her lack of mobility, both horizontal and vertical, makes it really hard to even clear high grounds, and something like a Winston would be much more fitting. Just before I continue, I'd like to mention that if you want to get coaching, check me out on Uscrim. If you want to get the best valued coaching out there, tailored to your needs as a player to quickly help you climb, I strongly recommend you check the top link in the description. Use code COACHING10 for 10% off your purchase. On with the video. Orisa, much more powerful from where she was 2 months ago. Likewise to Queen, I think her best map is Colosseo. Plenty of walls to smash an enemy into with a javelin, and also a pretty linear map to help rush down the enemy team. Her worst map is likely Dorado or Gibraltar. I could not tell you what Orisa is going to do on these maps. Good luck taking 5 years to reach high ground just to be surrounded by a dive comp. Ramattra. Still a great, all-around tank, despite some changes to his block and annihilation. I certainly think any of the Lijiang maps are up there too, as well as Antarctic Peninsula, Kings Row, Midtown, Basan Mecha Base, and Colosseo. However, his worst map really comes down to abusing his lack of mobility. On Gibraltar, he's really gonna struggle, and even on Hollywood too, if you're excluding first points. Unlike Queen or Orisa, Ramattra is pretty mediocre against dive comps. Reinhardt. Lijiang Control Center is without a doubt this guy's best map. Even when Reinhardt is out of meta, teams will still always play Reinhardt on this map. Super short sightlines, a plethora of cover, and awkward flank routes make this map his bread and butter. Worst map is likely Dorado. Shout out to Coach Spike for this one, and he's without a doubt right because in the Overwatch League, the London Spitfire ran Rush on Gibraltar, but they didn't run it on Dorado, and their Rush 1 tricks. Dorado is just too open for Reinhardt comps to work. Roadhog. Alright, I'm actually going to take this one seriously. His best map is likely Ilios Well or Nepal Sanctum, mainly because of the big gaping holes, and that does sound crazy out of context, I'm not gonna lie. His worst maps are ones where he just can't take an angle to fish for a hook, meaning it's likely Lijiang. I mean, when was the last time you saw a Roadhog on any Lijiang map? He just gets ran over before you can even look for a hook. Maybe that'll change with his rework, hopefully coming next season. Sigma. His best maps are obviously going to be a contest between Havana, Junkertown, and Circuit Royale. I'd probably lean ever so slightly towards Circuit Royale because at least on Havana, I could see something like a Reinhardt spawn camp strategy working. For worst map, I'm leaning towards Lijiang because either dive or brawl works on either 3 of those maps. And likewise to Hog, I can't tell you the last time I saw a Sigma being played on Lijiang. Winston. Because of how bad the other tanks are on this map, Gibraltar kinda has to be Winston's playground. Very traditional dive map, plenty of high ground to stage dives, while also not being too long sightlined either. Speaking of long sightlines and a lack of cover, Junkertown is what I think to be Winston's worst map. I challenge anyone watching this video to play Winston on Junkertown first point attack in a GM lobby and cap the first points. It's not happening, I'm sorry. Wrecking Ball. New Queen Street is what I think to be Wall's best map here. Plenty of flanks and rotations for you to make and get some roll throughs from behind, whilst also not being very long sightlines. For his worst map, I'd say Circuit Royale. No flank routes, bad map geometry for grapples, and it's just tough for ball all around. Zarya. Zarya's a weird one because she likes close to medium range, but doesn't want to get rolled over by a Reinhardt or Ramattra. All in all, I'd say King Zo is a pretty strong map for her, only really struggling on third points. Basan Mecha Base, Midtown, and Oasis Gardens are good shouts too. As for her worst maps, there's quite a few of them. Unlike Orisa, Ryan, or Queen, Zarya has zero horizontal mobility. This means on long-range maps, she can't close the distance or even clear high grounds. I'm gonna go for a slightly goofy pick in Hollywood, because even on first point, she can struggle quite a bit. Ashe. Route 66 is still her best map in my opinion. Medium range sightlines, plenty of high ground at angles for you to take, and land those juicy dynamites. Worst map I'd say is Circle Royale. The issue isn't that Ashe is bad on this map per se, it's just that one-shot heroes like Widowmaker are just a much better pick here. Bastion. The best maps for Bastion are super linear ones that have short to medium sightlines. As a result, Lijiang is up there alongside Nepal Shrine, Nepal Village, and Basan Mecha Base. However, as soon as we start opening up the map, and there's some long sightlines and big flanks to take, Bastion really falls down in value. New Queen Street, for example, can be really tough for him to play, especially if you're playing flankers on that map. Cassidy. His best map is honestly almost all of them. Like, I can't really say to you whether Cassidy is better on King Zo over Blizzard World, though I do think he's slightly better on Blizzard Worlds. He's generally good on maps that aren't swamped in high grounds that are inaccessible to Cassidy. Worst map I'm gonna say is Circle Royale. I don't know how many times I've said it in this video, but it probably shows how terrible of a map design Circle Royale is. Echo. Best map for her is Oasis Gardens. There's a ton of cover, rooftops and flanks for you to land your stickies and beam combo, and I think if you're creative in Circle Royale, she's pretty underrated there too. She's also great on Illy as well, since there's tons of high ground coastside to use. Her worst map is actually somewhat tough to choose. I think she's really weak against Sombra Tracer when she can't use high grounds, so maybe New Queen Street if you're playing against that specific comp. Genji. Best map, and this might come as a surprise, I think it's Havana or Rialto. There's a ton of high ground you can control and reach to, and up close, you can easily outduel a Widowmaker or Ashe on that high grounds. Even third point Havana, I think he can close that distance and get some good damage off with his dash. With his worst maps, similar to Echo, I think Genji suffers more against the comps he plays against rather than the maps he's on. But with that being said, I'm not a particular fan of Genji on Lijiang. I think it's too brawly and short sightlines for him to do anything on. Hanzo. His best map I think is honestly King's Row. Hanzo is weak against dive specifically, and does pretty well in brawly matchups. King's Row is a classic for that. And third point also has high ground that Hanzo can utilise that some other DPS like Cassidy just can't. His worst map is likely Ilios Ruins, or Nepal Village, or Lijiang Control Center. They're either too long sightlines, or there's not enough angles for him to take. Junkrat. Of course he's going to be pretty strong on Lijiang Control Center, where, by sheer luck, his grenades will just hit, but I think Antarctic Peninsula is pretty underrated for Junkrat for similar reasons. Worst map I think is either Junkertown or Hollywood. Hollywood might be a weird choice, but on attack, I think he's really hard to get value on, not just because of the sightlines, but also because of the lackluster flank routes, which are key for Junkrat to land this one-shot combo. Mei. Thrives on maps where you can get guaranteed value from your wall. King's Row, Colosseo, Oasis University, and Lijiang Control Center are all obvious picks here. Essentially a guaranteed win. Maps where the geometry is more open may can be a struggle to run. New Queen Street is a perfect example of such, and yes, I am aware of the stalling gimmick you can do, but apart from that, there's not much going for Mei here. Dorado, Gibraltar, and the Oasis City Centre are also places where she can struggle. Pharah. I actually think she's very underrated on Lijiang Control Center because of the little bit of high ground that you can use as cover, and for that same reason, Ilios, Dorado, Rialto, and Eichenwald tend to be pretty strong for her too, specifically the first points of Dorado and Rialto. Not to mention, there's tons of roofs to use as cover. Her worst map is likely anything on Antarctic Peninsula or even on Esperanza and Junkertown. Sightlines are either too short or too long respectively, and there's just no cover or high ground to use as a helipads. I also don't think she's great on Flashpoint either, both on New Junk City and Suravasa for the same reasons. Reaper. Cover is really important for Reaper to close the distance safely, so Nepal Shrine, Basan Mecha Base, or at least a single map on every Koth map is pretty good for Reaper. Reaper's biggest weakness however is his range. Good luck flanking and making sure that it's not telegraphed on something like Circle Royale, which is what I think to be his worst map. Sojourn. Similar to most DPSs, I think you can get away with Sojourn on most maps, so choosing her best one is pretty difficult to say the least. I'd maybe choose Rialto, Esperanza, or New Queen Street, because the rotations you can take to different angles and retain your railgun charge are pretty common. Her worst map on the other hand are maps where there's just more efficient picks, which honestly comes down to composition more so than maps. This will normally be longer range maps like Junkertown, where her railgun charge just depletes as soon as you take an angle and you also experience that railgun fall off range. Soldier 76. In my old video, I said Havana is the best map for Soldier, but now I think it's probably Eichenwald or Rialto. Good sightlines, good flanks, and good high grounds. Soldier needs to have the ability to hard flank, which he can do on these maps. His worst map might be Colosseo. Soldier doesn't have that much frontline pressure compared to someone like Mei, and the angles you can take require vertical mobility, which Soldier doesn't really have. Sorry to the grand total of 2 of you who commonly do Helix rocket jumps. Sombra. Again, I think composition has a lot to do with whether Sombra is a good pick or not really the map. With that being said, I think relatively open maps with sightlines that aren't too long, she can be pretty good in. Oasis City Centre, Nepal Shrine, Busan Sanctuary, or New Queen Streets. Worst map is tough to say because our worst heroes are against Cassidy and Hanzo, who only need to land 1 or 2 shots to force translocates. Maybe then, King Zo would be a solid shout, not to mention Sombra also can't access high ground unless she wastes her translocates. Symmetra. Thankfully Symmetra is pretty simple. Her best map is likely Lijiang in my opinion, just generally speaking across all the 3 maps. They're short sightlined and brawly to allow her to get to her level 3 beam whilst also having classic teleport plays for herself and her team. Her worst map is likely Circuit Royale. Reason why I didn't pick Junkertown is that while both maps are super long sightlines, Circuit Royale is very linear until 3rd point, meaning that it can be hard to flank with your TP. Torbjörn. Despite the recent changes, I still think Torb's best map is Blizzard World. Some classic turret spots to plonk on off angles or flanks, and the sightlines suit Torb pretty well. Generally speaking though, I think Torb is just better on defense than attack. With Torb's worst maps, despite Torb lacking the range, making him not a great pick on sniper-based maps, on attack, when trying to walk into an enemy team using high ground, Torb is really gonna struggle. Watchpoint Gibraltar and Dorado especially are great examples, as well as Hollywood too. I genuinely wonder how you're gonna attack Dorado second with Torbjörn. Tracer. Best map is New Queen Streets, so many flanks to take, and not too much high ground stopping you. Worst map however is King's Row. It's a bit too linear, and the flanks and angles that you can take are typically on high grounds. 3rd point especially can be a bit of a struggle. With that being said, Tracer is by no means a bad pick or completely unplayable on King's Row, which goes to show how strong she is. Widowmaker. Best map is Circuit Royale, and her worst map is Lijiang Control Center. No further discussion needed. Ana. The best maps for her are ones where you can get cheeky nades off on rotations. King's Row, Rialto, and even New Queen Street are pretty good picks for her. I actually have a coaching session going over how to best utilize Ana on New Queen Street, so check that out on the top right if you're interested. With worst maps, I believe ML7 had once said her worst map was Ilios Ruins because of how long the sightlines are, but honestly, there aren't too many maps where it's straight up unplayable to pick Ana. Baptiste. He thrives on maps or situations where you're running a hard brawl comp or a hard poke comp. Zen Bap is always going to do well on Circuit Royale, and Lúcio Bap is always going to do well on Lijiang. Individually, places where he can get value off his Exo Boots and his Matrix to deal damage, like Dorado or Route 66, are also good places for Bap. He's a jack of all trades kind of hero. As for his worst maps, again, it's mostly composition based. In other words, playing Baptiste with dive. And for that reason, I'd say Watchpoint Gibraltar or Numbani could be weak for Baptiste, even though there's plenty of high ground for you to exo jump up to. Same with Dorado, which I just put in the best section. It's really comp dependent. Brigitte. I still love playing Brig on Dorado. So many different angles and high grounds that you can control, and short silent flanks you can threaten. Dive is also commonplace on Dorado, where Brig thrives. As for her worst map, it's gotta be long range maps or short range brawly maps where you might as well play Mercy or Lúcio respectively. Junkertown and Lijiang are good examples of each, though I will say that if you're playing Poke, Sigma Brig as a frontline duo isn't half bad. Illari. New hero, so where do I think her best map is? Well, unfortunately, I don't have a simple answer. She's a very hybrid-esque hero, so it's tough nailing her down to a single map. I think she's great on the new Flashpoint maps, and on most escort and hybrid maps like King's Row, Eichenwald, or Rialto. Her worst map is quite a bit easier to choose though. Her fall-off really comes into play on Junkertown for example, and it's not like she's amazing on 3rd point either, where the sightlines become much shorter, and heroes like Brig can clear her off. Kiriko, super flexible, but her best maps are ones where she can hard flank and teleport back to her team with relative safety. King's Row on all 3 points is a perfect example, but you could honestly argue that any map is Kiriko's best because of how flexible she is. Her worst maps are ones that are super linear and force Kiriko into a heal bot playstyle, which isn't always a bad thing, but if you're playing against snipers, you might as well be playing Zen or Lifeweaver, hence why Circle Royale is likely her worst map. Lifeweaver. After receiving 1,000 different buffs, he's finally in a viable state. Still D tier though in my opinion. His best map is likely King's Row in my opinion. He can access and control those high grounds pretty easily, and heal his DPS and flankers easily too. His worst map is any sniper map. Likewise to Kiriko, this hero is pretty dogshit and useless if you're playing him on something like Circle Royale. I genuinely don't know what you're gonna do on this hero. On maps like Junkertown, at least if you're playing someone like Kiriko, you can hard flank. On Lifeweaver, because you haven't got her mobility, you can't really do that. Lúcio. The obvious choice here is Ilios because of the Reddit and boot potential, but speaking more seriously, I think Lúcio is really strong on King's Row and Rialto. He's also really strong on the new Flashpoint maps too. Not just in terms of speeding your tank in too, but also contesting high ground and rotating as a team. His worst maps are where you just don't need the speed boost and your comp is stationary. Hence why for the billionth time in this video, Circle Royale is once again the worst map for a hero. Mercy. Any maps where ranged hit scans like Ashe, Hanzo, Widow, Sojourn or Soldier can do well on, she'll do well on too. Route 66, Numbani, Esperanza, Rialto, and of course, the classic long-range maps will suit Mercy just fine. As for our worst map, it's gotta be Lijiang Control Center. Way too short sightlines, way too brawly, and very easy for her to get run over by a Lúcio comp. Moira. I said this before, but she's still really strong on Midtown. Fading to high ground and dueling DPS, as well as being within range to heal your team, is a pretty flexible playstyle. King's Row and Eichenwald are also pretty good maps too. With their worst maps, I find that when people struggle with Moira, it's more of a playstyle thing instead of a map thing. She's a budget Kiriko, so on maps where it's super hard to flank on, like Circle Royale, again, she's gonna struggle. Zenyatta. Range is the name of the game with Zenyatta, hence why Koth maps, generally speaking, aren't really great picks for him. Of course, your standard long maps, Zen is gonna do well on, but surprisingly, I don't think Lijiang Control Center is a terrible map for Zen, unlike a Mercy, which I think is to do with the threat of Discord and Zen's own damage outputs. Instead, I think something like Ilios Lighthouse, which is super awkward for Zen's positioning, can really be a hindrance. And that's it for the video. Shout out to my channel members, Slothdust, Xbenny, Ushiop, Wix, Broken by 50%, Suffering, Chris Jones, and Craig, and let me know your thoughts down below. Until next time.